Why was she standing there, in silence while they laughed at her? The words cut through the air like a blade. "Ma'am, with all due respect, the coffee station is in the back. Try not to touch anything important." Lieutenant Commander Marcus Thorne didn't lower his voice. He wanted everyone to hear. The junior officers responded exactly how he expected, nervous laughter rippling through the polished command floor. They were young, hungry for approval, and Thorne was their gatekeeper. Evelyn Hayes took a sip of her coffee. That's all she did. Her gray eyes stayed fixed on the holographic display, blue icons, red icons, a simulated naval war unfolding in real time. She didn't flinch, didn't turn. Her silence was a void that swallowed Thorne's arrogance whole. But high above them in the glass-walled observation deck, someone else was watching. Fleet Admiral Garrett's eyes narrowed. He didn't see a civilian in plain clothes. He saw the way she stood, parade ground stillness, perfect balance, decades of discipline in her posture. He saw the way her eyes tracked the tactical display, not confusion, predatory focus. He saw a ghost from his past. And he knew this was going to get interesting. The condescension didn't stop. It became the background noise of the morning, a relentless campaign of petty humiliations. Thorne made a grand show of explaining basic concepts, his voice dripping with patronizing slowness. "You see, ma'am, the blue icons are us and the red icons are the bad guys." He gestured dramatically at the billion-dollar interface. "This large one here, that's an aircraft carrier. It's like a floating airport. Very important." The junior officers chuckled on cue. They always did. Hayes nodded. Her face remained calm, a still lake that Thorne desperately tried to disturb. He lobbed complex technical questions at her, rhetorical traps designed to expose ignorance. "Can you explain the probability curve of an Aegis intercept against a salvo of hypersonic missiles with plasma stealth shielding?" Her answer was flat, simple. "The data is on the screen." It wasn't weakness. It was refusal. She wouldn't be baited into an argument she didn't need to have. And that infuriated Thorne more than any retort could have. He saw it as confirmation she didn't belong here. The junior officers followed his lead. They turned their backs when she approached, lowered their voices, created a physical barrier of youthful arrogance around the tactical consoles. She was an outsider, a foreign object in their specialized world, and they treated her exactly as such. But here's what they didn't see. While they performed for each other, while they fed Thorne's ego with knowing smirks and synchronized laughter, Hayes was working, her hands steady, her presence a quiet rebuke to the chaos around her. She wasn't watching the main screen like they were. She was tracking the subtle data streams scrolling on a forgotten auxiliary monitor, seeing patterns no one else noticed. She saw the fatal flaw in Thorne's strategy. Beautiful, aggressive, textbook, and completely predictable. She was watching a man lead his fleet into a perfectly calculated ambush, and she said nothing. Her patience wasn't kindness. It was discipline. The kind learned in places far more dangerous than this air-conditioned room. She'd learned long ago that the system was designed to teach, and the most effective teacher was often catastrophic failure. Thorne was about to receive a master class. But there was something else, something she carried with her that morning, a memory she couldn't shake. Years ago she'd been the young officer, the one desperate to prove herself, the one who'd made mistakes in front of people who mattered. Someone had given her grace then, hadn't humiliated her, had let her learn. She was returning that favor now, even if Thorne didn't deserve it. What happens when arrogance meets reality at full speed? The collapse began not with a bang, but with a flicker. A single red icon appeared on the board, a supposedly neutralized enemy submarine, deep inside Thorne's carrier group's defensive perimeter. "Impossible," Thorne scoffed, waving a dismissive hand. "That's a sensor ghost, a glitch in the simulation. Ignore it." But it wasn't a glitch, it was the first domino. Within seconds, the ghost launched a full spread of simulated torpedoes. Acoustic alarms blared, a synthetic scream of technological panic. The icon for the USS Nimitz, the centerpiece of Thorne's fleet, flashed catastrophic red before dissolving into a cloud of digital debris. A collective gasp sucked the air from the room. Thorne's face went pale, his smug composure shattered like glass. Where did that come from? How'd it get through the screen? His voice cracked. The confidence drained out of him in real time. Before anyone could answer, the real attack began. From the west, a swarm of enemy fighters, previously masked by an electronic warfare screen Thorne had arrogantly dismissed as a minor nuisance, screamed toward the now exposed fleet. Simultaneously, from orbit, a volley of hypersonic missiles began their terminal descent, their trajectories perfectly timed to coincide with the submarine attack. It was brilliant, a symphony of destruction, multi-domain assault orchestrated by the simulation's unforgiving AI. Red icons bloomed across the map like blood in water. Thorne's ships were systematically eliminated. His textbook defenses, so impressive on paper, crumbled against a strategy that was fluid, creative, and utterly ruthless. The room descended into chaos. Junior officers shouted conflicting reports, hands flying across consoles in desperate, futile attempts to stem the tide. Thorne was frozen, a deer in the headlights of his own failure. His mind couldn't process the speed and totality of his defeat. He'd been so sure, so confident. Now he was drowning. In the midst of this panic, Evelyn Hayes moved, not to the command console, not to Thorne. She walked to a small secondary terminal manned by a young, overwhelmed ensign. She didn't raise her voice. She simply leaned in and spoke quietly, a calm anchor in the storm. "Ensign, divert all power from forward sensors to the aft CIWS batteries. Retask satellite surveillance to scan grid 47B, thermal only, and link the fire control of the destroyers Arleigh Burke and John Paul Jones. Now." The ensign's eyes went wide, terrified. He looked from the crumbling tactical map to the calm, authoritative face of this strange civilian woman. He saw no panic in her eyes, only an unnerving certainty. He looked at his commander. Thorne was still stammering, utterly lost. In that moment the ensign made a choice. He chose competence over rank. His fingers flew across the keyboard, inputting the commands exactly as she'd given them, and everything changed. The close-in weapon systems on the two remaining destroyers, their power grids suddenly supercharged, erupted in a storm of computer-guided cannon fire. Impenetrable walls of metal shredded the incoming missile salvo just meters from their targets. The retasked satellite, ignoring the obvious threat to focus on a seemingly empty patch of ocean, revealed the thermal signature of a stealth submarine attempting to reposition for a second strike. The linked fire control systems on the destroyers coordinated instantly, launching a precision torpedo spread that eliminated the threat before it could fire again. The tide turned, not gradually, instantly. Thorne's remaining ships, guided by Hayes' invisible hand through the frightened but obedient ensign, began a coordinated counterattack. They used deception, misdirection, asymmetric tactics that the enemy AI hadn't anticipated. Within minutes, the red icons were gone. The blue icons stood victorious. The room fell silent, stunned silence. Thorne stared at the board, his mouth open, his career flashing before his eyes. He'd been saved, but he hadn't saved himself, and everyone in the room knew it. Hayes stepped back from the console. She didn't celebrate, didn't gloat. She simply returned to her position near the back wall and took another sip of her coffee. But something had shifted. The air itself felt different. Could one moment of silence say more than a lifetime of words? The doors to the command floor opened, heavy, deliberate. Fleet Admiral Garrett descended the staircase from the observation deck. His footsteps echoed in the suffocating quiet. Every eye in the room turned toward him. The junior officers straightened instinctively. Even Thorne, still shell-shocked, snapped to attention. Garrett walked past all of them. He didn't stop at Thorne's station. He didn't acknowledge the tactical displays or the salvaged simulation. He walked directly to where Evelyn Hayes stood, still holding her ceramic mug, her expression unchanged. And then he did something no one expected. Fleet Admiral Garrett, one of the most decorated officers in the United States Navy, came to attention. In a gesture of supreme respect, a gesture he reserved for only a handful of peers, he snapped a crisp, perfect salute. "Admiral Hayes," he said, his voice ringing with authority and deference. "Welcome to my command. The floor is yours." He held the salute, his eyes locked on hers, a silent public apology, a profound acknowledgement of her true station. He was correcting the record, restoring the order that Thorne's ignorance had disrupted. "Admiral Hayes." The words detonated in the minds of every person in that room. The woman they'd mocked, the civilian they'd dismissed, the outsider they'd excluded. She wasn't a guest. She wasn't a consultant. She was one of them, higher than all of them. Thorne's face went from pale to ashen. The junior officers who'd laughed at her that morning couldn't meet her eyes. Shame washed over them in waves. They'd judged a master by the plainness of her clothes. They'd mistaken silence for weakness. They'd confused humility with incompetence. Hayes returned the salute with the same precision, the same quiet dignity she'd carried all morning. "Thank you, Admiral Garrett. I believe the exercise was instructive." Her voice was soft, but it carried weight, the weight of experience, of battles fought in places these young officers had only read about, of decisions made under pressure they couldn't imagine. The quiet professional had been validated. Her silence finally explained, not as weakness, but as the calm at the center of a hurricane of experience and authority. And in that moment, a legend was born. How does a single story change an entire institution? The story didn't just spread. It detonated. It raced through encrypted networks connecting global command centers. It was whispered in the hushed confines of submarine control rooms. It was told with awe and reverence in mess halls of ships halfway around the world. Every detail was magnified, every nuance mythologized. They spoke of how she never raised her voice, how her eyes saw the hidden currents of battle, how with 3 sentences she'd unraveled a strategy that had humbled one of the Navy's most arrogant rising stars. The saved simulation log was immediately classified, designated the Hayes Doctrine. It was sent to the Naval War College in Newport, where it became the centerpiece of a new curriculum on asymmetrical thinking. Cadets spent weeks dissecting those 3 simple commands, marveling at the layers of strategic genius contained within them. The understanding of power distribution, the creative use of surveillance assets, the seamless integration of disparate platforms. It was a masterclass in modern naval combat, delivered not in a lecture hall, but in the crucible of a simulated crisis. Lieutenant Commander Thorne became a cautionary tale. He wasn't court-martialed. He wasn't publicly disgraced. Admiral Hayes wouldn't have allowed it. Her philosophy was about building competence, not destroying careers. Instead, Fleet Admiral Garrett reassigned him. Thorne was stripped of his prestigious post at the Aegis Nexus and sent to serve as a tactical action officer aboard a destroyer in the Pacific Fleet, under the command of a captain who had served as Hayes' flag lieutenant a decade prior. It was a humbling, a forced return to the fundamentals, a chance to learn the humility he so desperately lacked. The first thing his new captain said to him was simple, direct. "Here, your opinion means nothing. Your results mean everything. We run things the Hayes way." For Thorne, it was the beginning of a long, arduous journey back. A journey defined by the memory of a quiet woman and the deafening silence that followed her victory. Back at the Aegis Nexus, the cultural shift was immediate and permanent. The atmosphere of chest-thumping arrogance evaporated, replaced by something more sober, more focused, more collaborative. Junior officers no longer competed to be the loudest. They competed to be the most observant. They started listening more than they spoke. They studied the data on auxiliary monitors, searching for the subtle patterns that Admiral Hayes had seen. The ensign she'd spoken to became a minor celebrity. His peers sought him out, wanting to know exactly what he'd seen in her eyes, how her voice had sounded. It wasn't like she was giving an order, he would say, his voice full of wonder. It was like she was just telling me something that was already true. Admiral Hayes, for her part, deflected all praise. She remained for another week, observing other simulations. She spoke quietly with the young officers, not lecturing, asking questions, gently guiding them to their own conclusions. She treated them with a respect Thorne had never afforded them. And in doing so, she earned a fierce loyalty that no amount of shouting could ever command. A photograph was taken that week, a candid shot of her leaning over a console, pointing something out to a young lieutenant. The photo was framed and hung on the wall of the command floor, right next to the portraits of decorated fleet admirals. There was no nameplate, no caption, there didn't need to be. Everyone who walked that floor knew who she was. She was the ghost. She was the standard. She was the quiet professional whose competence had spoken louder than any boast. A permanent reminder that in the serious business of naval warfare, assumptions were a luxury no one could afford. What legacy do we leave when we choose dignity over dominance? Months later, the ripple effects of that day continued to expand. The Hayes Doctrine had evolved from a single simulation file into a comprehensive overhaul of naval wargaming philosophy. It forced a shift away from rigid, predictable strategies toward a new emphasis on adaptability, deception, and multi-domain integration. The Navy began actively seeking out and promoting a different kind of officer, not the swaggering fighter jock, not the arrogant surface warfare commander, but the quiet analytical thinkers, the ones who, like Hayes, saw the entire board and understood that the most powerful weapon in any arsenal was a well-ordered mind. The institution itself was learning humility. At the Naval Academy, a new seminar became mandatory for all first-year midshipmen. It was called The Ghost of Aegis, and it used deconstructed data from the infamous simulation as its core text. The final lesson was always the same. Respect is not automatically conferred by the insignia on your collar. It is earned through the quiet, consistent, and undeniable demonstration of your competence. The story became folklore, a teaching tool passed down from one generation of officers to the next, a modern parable about the dangers of pride and the power of silent professionalism. A year passed. Lieutenant Commander Thorne, humbled and remade by his tour in the Pacific, returned to the Aegis Nexus, not as a commander, as an instructor. He was a different man. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a quiet intensity. He now taught the Hayes Doctrine to the new generation of officers, using his own catastrophic failure as the primary example. I looked at Admiral Hayes and I saw what I wanted to see, he would tell them, his voice steady and filled with the weight of hard-earned wisdom. I saw a civilian, an outsider, a woman. I saw everything but the truth. He paused, let that sink in. Don't make my mistake. The most dangerous person in any room is the one you underestimate. Look for competence, not for conformity. Listen to the quiet voices. They are the ones who see the whole picture. The young officers listened, really listened, because Thorne's humility was more powerful than his arrogance had ever been. He'd lived the lesson. He'd paid the price. And now he was offering them a gift, the chance to learn without having to fail first. The legacy of Admiral Hayes wasn't in the medals she'd won. It wasn't in the high-level strategies she'd designed. It was in the change she'd inspired. It was in the young ensign who now confidently challenged a captain's flawed plan, armed with data and logic. It was in the humbled commander who had transformed his greatest failure into his most powerful teaching tool. It was in a navy that was slowly but surely learning that its greatest strength wasn't in its ships or its weapons, but in the minds of its people. True legacy isn't what you leave behind in a file. It's what continues to move forward in the actions and beliefs of others. It's the quiet competence that echoes long after the battle is over, shaping the future in ways the loud and the arrogant can never comprehend. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is nothing at all. Just stand there, watch, wait, and when the moment comes when chaos erupts and everyone else is shouting, speak once, quietly, with absolute certainty. Because dignity doesn't need to announce itself. It doesn't need to defend itself. It doesn't need validation from those who can't recognize it. Dignity simply acts, and in acting it teaches. Admiral Hayes understood something that took most people a lifetime to learn. You don't prove your worth by demanding respect. You prove it by being so undeniably competent that respect becomes inevitable. She never raised her voice that day. She never needed to. Her silence was her strength, her patience was her power, and her competence was her legacy. The young officers at the Aegis Nexus still tell her story. They still study her moves. They still quote her 3 commands like scripture. But the real lesson isn't in what she said. It's in what she didn't say. It's in the coffee she sipped while they laughed, the calm she maintained while they mocked, the focus she kept while they dismissed her. It's in the choice she made, not to prove herself to people who didn't deserve the lesson, but to save them anyway when the moment demanded it. That's the difference between authority and arrogance. Authority doesn't need to be seen. It doesn't need to be heard. It exists in the steady hand, the clear eye, the disciplined mind. And when it finally speaks, the whole world listens. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts.